Welcome to my guide video series for reading Hamlet. I'm hosting this as a part of a year-long book club on Instagram, but these videos will continue to stay up for anyone, anytime. This first video will be an introduction to the play, and I think it will be helpful to watch this before you start reading the play, or before you watch the play. And then there will be a video for each act, and you can watch them before or after you read each act, but I would suggest you watch it before you move on to the next act. I'm really excited to guide you through Hamlet, whether this is your first time or your 15th time. I know many of you in this read-along have taught the play or have had experience with it in the theater, but I want to share a line from the book Shakespeare After All. It says, "Indeed, as many commentators have observed, the experience of Hamlet is always that of recognition, of recalling, remembering, or identifying some already known phrase or image." And I really like this because there's so much from Hamlet that has seeped into the culture of the world, whether it be phrases that we use all the time now, or thoughts and questions that arise as you read it that feel familiar. Even if it's your first time, this play will likely have something in it that feels familiar to you. There is so much commentary on Hamlet, so many differing opinions about Hamlet as a character, his inner thoughts and motives. The intro of the Signet edition quotes William Hazlitt when he says, "If we wish to know the force of human genius, we should read Shakespeare. If we wish to see the insignificance of human learning, we may study his commentators." And Oscar Wilde even made fun of the common question, is Hamlet mad or is he pretending to be? By saying, are the commentators on Hamlet mad or are they only pretending to be? Now, part of the reason that there are so many mixed opinions on Hamlet as a character, as a play, is because there were two different versions of the play. One from 1604 and one from 1623. The first one is the longest. It has 222 lines that aren't in the later one. But the one from 1623 has 83 lines that are not included in the earlier one. And they can have an effect on how we think of Hamlet. For example, in one text, the line is solid flesh, and in one it's solid flesh. The first quarto is now thought by scholars to possibly be a copy of someone who wrote it down based on a performance of the play or written down by memory from one of the actors. But the current editions are a combination of the two quartos. So all the extra lines from each version are put together into one now. And this makes the play Shakespeare's longest. Hamlet has more lines than any other character. So after knowing this, maybe you can see why I feel a bit intimidated to lead you through this play. I want to do it justice, but I don't want to just be another commentator stuck in my views. Hopefully I can open your eyes a bit so that you can come to your own conclusions. That being said, I do have my own view on how I see the character Hamlet, and it does support the way I like to break down acting a character and the style of acting that I personally prefer. I've read and I've studied this play so many times now. When I was in college, I felt like we had to study it and write a paper about it every semester. But some of the questions, as you read it, you'll notice that provides so much commentary and differing views are: one, is Hamlet mad or is he pretending to be? Two, how does Hamlet feel about revenge? Three, why does Hamlet procrastinate in doing the thing the ghost tells him to do? That's possibly one of the more talked about questions. So Shakespeare definitely did not come up with this play on his own. He was heavily influenced by past versions of this story, and most likely by other writers of revenge tragedy too. Seneca was one of these. He was a very famous Roman writer who was known for writing these fairly gory tragedies and revenge stories. And he also had an influence on the presence of ghosts in revenge tragedies. So the first time we see the story of Hamlet written down in literature was in the 12th century by Saxo Grammaticus. And it was most likely a story that was told orally before that, maybe of a family feud or a Viking feud. This book by Grammaticus was an account of around 60 legendary Danish kings. And this was one of the stories within that book. And the story was far more gory, and the names were different in this version. So Hamlet, the character, was Amlethus, or sometimes referred to as Amleth in this version. He pretends to be crazy in order to get revenge. which is what we see in Shakespeare's version as well. In the Grammaticus version, there was no ghost, and it was not a secret that the king, how the king died. But so much of this story is the same as Shakespeare's. There's no evidence that any of this story was actually historical. There might be little bits of truth in it or nods to scenarios that actually happened in history with other kings. And there's some events in history that you could look at and maybe see hints of in Hamlet. So from these nods and hints, if we had to make a rough guess of when the events of Hamlet would be set, it would probably be around the year 1050. In the 1500s, a man named Francois Belafrost wrote his version of the story, and it was French. He made the change of making the queen adulteress. So she was committing adultery with the king's brother before the king died. He was most likely not the source that Shakespeare used, though, because it wasn't translated into English until later. It's not 100% confirmed, but it was most likely that Shakespeare was influenced by Thomas Kyd. So there was this other version of Hamlet called the Hamlet, spelled U-R, Hamlet. We don't know the name of the actual play because we don't have it. It's not written. We don't have a written version of it still, but we have written commentary about it. So things that people saw after they saw this play. And we suspect it was Thomas Kyd, and we suspect that Thomas Kyd read this French version before, and that Shakespeare went on and read or saw, or maybe even performed in the Thomas Kyd version, because we also know that Chamberlain's men performed it, and Shakespeare was a part of that group. Now, you've heard me call this a revenge tragedy, and I call it that because it is different from other tragedies where you have a tragic hero, as it's called in literature. A tragic hero is someone who is usually in a position of power, and they have a tragic flaw that sets some horrible scenario into motion, and they make what is called a tragic error. But in revenge tragedy, it's just a little bit different. I mean, it's very similar, but a little bit different. You have a hero who doesn't start the chain of events. He is kind of forced into a situation and then from there muddles everything up. And this is very influenced by these plays of Seneca. I like what the Signet version says about this. I'm going to quote it. It says, "The avenger begins at a disadvantage and is forced to engage in intrigue. Caught up in a situation not of his own making and confronted with a powerful and unscrupulous foe, the avenger is commonly forced to perform deeds as monstrous as or even more monstrous than those that goad him into motion. The theme is from crime to greater crime, the digging, so to speak, of a deeper pit, perhaps with spikes in its bottom, or the rolling of a heavier rock onto the initial offender. Thus, Medea's husband deserts her, and maddened, she punishes him by murdering their children as well as his new bride." The play takes place in Elsinore. Today it's called Helsingør, and those who live in England call it that. And it's about 25 miles north of Copenhagen. And there's a castle in Helsingør called Kronborg Castle. It was built 20 years before Shakespeare wrote Hamlet, so while it wouldn't have been a location of the original Amlethus story, it was probably what Shakespeare had in mind as he wrote it. Hamlet the play opens on this castle, and we immediately feel this sense of dread. All Shakespeare needs to do is start the play with a question: who's there? And we are already on guard and on the lookout for danger. I just want to share a couple facts about Hamlet real quick, because these are kind of fun. It's the most performed play, most written about literary work, the most translated play, and it has inspired more spin-offs and adaptations than any other play. The line "to be or not to be" is one of the most quoted lines in the English language. And there have been many different versions of the character himself. There have been old Hamlets, women Hamlets, even one with a wooden leg. There have been naked Hamlets, Hamlets played by twins to show his dual nature. And here's the craziest one that I've ever heard. It's my favorite one. He was once played by a 5-year-old named Master Betty, the infant phenomenon of the Regency period. I think that's hilarious. And he's a very hard character to play. He is so in his head, he's constantly changing his moods and actions that it's sometimes hard to give him a clear objective and a motive. and then to portray that in a way that the audience could even grasp. He changes his style of speaking a lot, depending on who he's with. If he's alone, he's very ponderous and philosophical. When he's with others, he's usually articulate and his wit is razor sharp, but he's less philosophical. But sometimes when he's with others, he also has a lot of hidden meanings in his words, kind of where he says something but conceals his real meaning. He also switches frequently between prose and verse, kind of adding to this evasiveness. When he's serious, he's usually using verse. And when there's comedy or jesting, he uses prose. He also uses prose when he's pretending to be crazy. And when Ophelia loses her mind, she also switches to prose, as do other characters who have gone mad in other plays by Shakespeare, like Lady Macbeth or King Lear. The prose kind of is a manifestation of frenzied thoughts, and verse of collected and ordered thoughts. He also uses prose when he's talking down to someone of lower class or someone he looks down on, like Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, or the Gravediggers, as prose was often used for more low-class characters. And he's a very tricky character to play, for sure. Orson Welles said this of the role of Hamlet: once Shakespeare had written him, he never wrote about a man of any genius at all again. Once he'd written Hamlet and discovered that there was no actor who could play him, he turned to something else. And you have to admit, Hamlet is a character unlike any other of Shakespeare's characters. Okay, I'm going to let you get reading in just a minute, but I quickly want to point out some of the main themes in Hamlet that you can keep an eye out for as you go. And this is not a complete list. These are just some of the ones I thought of as I was reading. Number 1, the lack of certainty. How does the lack of certainty affect the things Hamlet does? We start out the play with a ghost, and already Hamlet isn't certain what to think, and if it's actually the spirit of his father or not. We start the play with a question, and we question everything alongside Hamlet. Number 2, things and people not being the way they seem. The word seem is key in this play. Hamlet talks about how he doesn't seem a certain way, he just is, and everyone else is pretending, which is interesting because he does a lot of pretending himself in the play. We have a lot of language of the theater, a lot of language of acting. There's a play within a play. There's a scene where Hamlet gives advice to a group of actors, and later he goes on to do a bit of pretending himself. And all throughout the whole play, Hamlet's using phrases referring to acting, to makeup, to clothes concealing or revealing his true nature. I'm going to talk about this more a bit later too. Okay, the third one, the mystery of death and what happens when we die, and even how death reduces everyone to the same state in the end. Hamlet thinks about this a lot. Number 4, the nation of Denmark compared to a body in its varying levels of health and disease, and as its levels of corruption vary. Number 5, everyone watching everyone. How is everyone spying on each other? Always watching and eavesdropping and hiding and sneaking. Never communicating, just sneaking. And how does this affect the characters and the outcomes of the play? And the last one is boundaries, and where are they? And when do things bleed into duality? And how do they shift? We have the literal boundary disputes going on with Norway and Denmark and Poland. This is a big part of the backstory. And then you have the boundaries between youth and age, between sanity and insanity, between life and death, revenge and murder, reality and imagination, between actor and audience. And, these boundaries are constantly moving and shifting. There's a lot more motifs and symbols and metaphors, but I'm going to stop right here, and I'll bring up a lot of things as we read in each act. And I really look forward to studying this play with you. If you need extra help with the lines, and don't feel bad if you do, I even need help a lot of the time, I suggest the No Fear Shakespeare books, because you can have a kind of an interpretation on one side as you read if you need to check every once in a while. I hope you enjoy this play, and I will see you in the next video. Good luck.